and yeah, Monero is one of the top alternative blockchains, alternative coins, with a very interesting concept and very interesting focus and implementation, and very interesting team as well. Yeah, but let's start, Justin. I don't like to steal your time. Take all of this.
Thank you. Okay, so before I get around to introducing myself and talking about Monero, which is a secure, private, and untraceable cryptocurrency, I want to actually first start by talking about Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin came out, I think the number one reason that people found it revolutionary was because it was the first time you can trust a system with your money without having to worry about trusting anyone else in the system. Previously, you needed to trust a bank or PayPal or some specific central entity, but this was a way to keep money secure without actually going through a centralized system. So sure, people originally thought it was cool for the low fees and that it worked nationwide, but a lot of centralized services either do that or can do that. So the real reason, in my opinion, it took off is because it was decentralized. However, when people started using Bitcoin, they realized that it lacked two important features that cash has, and that's privacy and fungibility. With privacy, when you send a transaction with Bitcoin, you can directly see in the blockchain, stored forever for everyone to see and verify, that an amount of Bitcoin was sent from one account to another account. And again, that's recorded forever. And it's not my name that's recorded as the address, it's a random string of numbers and letters, so it's pseudonymous, and a lot of people thought that this was good enough to begin with. However, this address is linked to you in several ways, so we're seeing now, especially with advanced temporal analysis, that this pseudonymous nature isn't good enough for privacy and fungibility. So your Bitcoin address is known to exchanges who likely know a lot of information about you. They're known to whoever you receive Bitcoin from when you're receiving a payment, or whoever you're sending Bitcoin to. And all of these people know how much money you have in this address. Furthermore, even if you try to use multiple accounts, you might be fooling me as a random end user, but you're not going to be fooling people that go through the time to go through temporal analysis. And the people that go through the effort of doing this temporal analysis are large agencies and also the exchanges. The exchanges will go through the previous history of how the Bitcoin was spent in the past, and they will blacklist certain coins based off how they were previously used. So let's say that I received Bitcoin for an eBay transaction, and it was a completely legal transaction, nothing wrong with it. I could be selling like an artwork I made or something. Like, it's completely normal. But let's say the money I received for this is money that someone previously used in some drug money like technique in the past. And so I, as a seller on eBay, don't have an easy way to verify how it was previously used if they took some steps to conceal their identity. But the exchange probably would, and so they could block my coins. And so even though I have, like, let's say 1 Bitcoin, I can't actually use it. And so that's where fungibility comes in. Fungibility is just the property of money that one note of one value is worth the same as another. So the 10 euro note you have in your wallet is worth the same that I have in my wallet, assuming they're not counterfeit, right? So with Bitcoin, we're seeing that since it doesn't have the privacy, and since you can look up how the money was previously spent, it doesn't have the fungibility either. So Monero tries to address these problems by providing privacy for all transactions in order to allow fungibility throughout the network. Okay, so now moving on to introduce myself. My name is Justin Ehrenhofer. I'm a second-year student studying Finance and Management Information Systems at the University of Minnesota. At Minnesota, I'm also the co-president of my school's cryptocurrency club there, and we have a good following, but we're a little over a year old now. And I'm currently on a semester exchange program at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, which makes it a lot easier for me to take a weekend to come here. Online, you might notice my username on Reddit as Samsung Galaxy Player. No, I'm not sponsored by Samsung. I don't even have a Samsung anymore. But at the time when I made the Reddit account, I made the username the same as the device I was using Reddit on at the time because I was a little lazy. So it's just kind of stuck with me at this point. As far as my official role with the Monero project, so I technically have some commits to the GitHub repository, but they're for the website, so they don't really count. So I was just adding a post to the forum there, or the blog there. So I'm not exactly a developer for this project, and I don't really pretend to be. I mostly focus on documentation, so things like the Stack Exchange, moderation on the Monero mining wiki, and several others. And I'm currently trying to work with the community members in order to come up with ways to expand the community so that we have more people working on Monero-related projects. But I'm not a developer, and my recent role has been to go around giving these talks because it's just something that I feel comfortable with, and Ricardo can't be everywhere at once, right? So, when people understood that Bitcoin wasn't really private enough for what they wanted to do, at least just on the protocol level, they said, okay, we already have this strong system here, has a strong network of miners, let's add something to it to make it private. At least that was their idea. And so they came up with the ideas of coin join through mixing and tumbling. You may have heard some of these terms before. And the idea is you would use a centralized system you can see there it looks like a mixer, right? So it's a centralized server that several people take their Bitcoin and they send it to the centralized system. And then this centralized system will mix up whose coins are whose, and then send those like a fraction to each person. And then ideally to an outside observer, they wouldn't know where the funds came from or are going now in the future. Like this ideally would break the loop. But there are really three fundamental issues with this type of approach. First is that the only people who opt in to use this feature, which costs additional money, are people who need to mix their coins in order to try and avoid something. Very few people are mixing coins that they just mine because they need to pay extra to do that, and why would they, right? So as a result, you see that most of the coins that go through a mixing process is money that was previously used illicitly. So you're not exactly helping yourself using a lot of these mixing services if you're just mixing a lot of money that exchanges consider bad together. It doesn't really help you. Second is that since you're trusting the centralized service to mix them for you, you don't actually know if they're deleting the history of how they're distributing the funds. They could just be holding on to the history, so you think it's private, but to them, it's not private at all. They still have a link here. So you're trusting the centralized service, and there's no way for you to know if they kept their end of the bargain. And then finally, from a practicality standpoint, it takes a while, because you need to wait for other participants on the network to also mix. If you're the little orange Bitcoin there, and you need to wait for these other users to come and participate in the first place. If no one else wants to participate, you're going to be waiting a very long time. And so we see that services that use coin join as a system to try and get privacy, like Dash, they try to mitigate the centralization issue by having you mix it up to 8 times. But with that instance, it could take several weeks for you to mix your coins, and you still have the same fundamental problems. So Monero takes a much different approach to mixing, and it tries to obfuscate all the information on the blockchain instead of trying to add something on top of it in order to just obfuscate some of the transactions in some ways. And it really does it through these 4 ways, and I'm going to go through all these 4 ways in detail. So first, the sender is hidden with ring signatures. An improvement as of January of this year to ring signatures also hides the transaction amount with ring confidential transactions. This is an adaptation of Gregory Maxwell's confidential transactions for Bitcoin to work with the ring signatures in Monero. The transaction broadcast is currently not hidden, but people are working on an I2P integration with Kavri, and I'll get to that more in detail because that's one of the coolest projects I think that's happening with Monero. And then finally, the receiver is hidden through the use of stealth addresses. So let's start by jumping directly into the ring signatures. So I want you to first think of the entire money supply of all of the euros just in one place. It's a big pile of money. And as you know, this money is divided into different denominations. You have your 10, 20, 50 euro notes. Monero is basically the same way. You have all of your Monero stored in the ledger, and it's divided into different outputs of certain value. So one of these might be 1 Monero, another might be 0.05 Monero. It would really vary on all the inputs, and most of them will probably all be different. And I want you to consider this red one here as one that you control. It's as if it showed up in your wallet balance, or if you had like euros in your pocket. This is one that you have. When you use Monero, we want to hide that this output is the one that's actually being spent, because we don't want people to be able to go through, say, hey, this output was previously used in this way, so I won't accept it. We want to make it so that people don't know which output they're accepting. And so how do you do this? That's where the ring signatures come into play. So instead of just making it seem like you're spending your input, you also make it appear as if you're as if you're spending other inputs as well. So in this case, I had the wallet software simulate selecting 5 other inputs in blue, and so these are ones that you don't control. Someone else in the world has control over these, but you don't. Yet you're still going to use them to hide which one is the real one. So how that goes into the ring signature, you start off again with your own. Your wallet software will select the others. And so as you can see here, although we know that yours is highlighted red, an outside observer would not know that this one is highlighted red. They would all appear to be identical. So as a result, you don't know where the origin of the money is actually coming from, because it appears like all of them are being spent simultaneously. In this instance, I used a ring size of 6, so 6 total inputs. Right now in the network, you need to include at least 2 other inputs when you send it. So you can't send a transaction with just your own. The network will just completely reject it. Later on this year in September, there's discussions to increase it, so you have to have at least 4 others, although there is some discussion to increase that number as high as 10, because we know that if you are hidden among 10 other inputs, it's better than being hidden among 3 other inputs, right? And currently you can select whatever number of inputs you want right now. So if you want to send a transaction with 1,000 other inputs, you can. It's up to you. Yes?
How much do you pay the fee per input?
The fee per input is very small now. Before Ring CT, it used to be pretty large, but now you can increase the ring size by about 200% and pay about a 5% additional fee. So it's much smaller than it used to be about a few months ago. So yes, you pay a little bit more because the transaction is larger, but it's relatively small considering the privacy advantages. Now, one question I always get is, if you make it appear as if you spend other people's money, what prevents you from trying to fool the network into actually spending other people's money? Because that would clearly be bad, right? And that's where the key image comes in. The key image is like a hash. It's not quite a hash. And if you're really interested in how it works, I can point you to a research paper on it. But it's like a hash of the input you do have. So if you change any of the other inputs, it won't change the key image. And nodes just need to verify 2 things to make sure that this transaction is legitimate. So 1, it needs to verify that it hasn't seen it before, so you're not trying to double spend, and that it actually is a reference to the input you do have, and you're not trying to throw a random number at the network, because then you'd be trying to basically spend someone else's money or money that you don't actually have. So that's where the key image comes into play. So this is kind of how the transaction, at least first part of it, looked going into January. After January, there was an improvement on it to also hide the transaction amounts. Because if you don't use the Ring CT feature, as you can see here, or I guess if you don't quite see here yet, but you would actually know the value of all these inputs. So you would know the red one is like 10 XMR. You would know that the first blue one is 3 XMR. And that's a problem because you can try and trace the amounts that are being used in the Monero network. And so that's not a good thing. So we decided we wanted to hide transaction amounts entirely. So instead of using the whole input, instead you're going to commit to use only a fraction of these inputs with Peterson commitments. So you can see here in the example, I used about half of each. Obviously this will vary from each transaction. And that is done through the Peterson commitment. I'm not going to get too much into it because it is a very complicated topic, but it really consists of two parts. So one is the actual amount. So if you're sending 10 Monero, that's the actual amount. And the second is a random number that only you know. And so you will use this random number, the same random number, to calculate both the inputs and the outputs. And so, as you can see here, as long as the sum is the same, as long as the RCT value for both the inputs and the outputs are the same, you know someone's not trying to artificially make themselves have more money or something. And so that's how we verify, Monero verifies that you aren't trying to generate extra coins through this process. And so finally, you go through the whole process of actually creating the signature, which is what you later propagate to the rest of the network, and it results in you sending an unknown amount of XMR because people don't know what it is anymore. And then as an output, you have the commitment public key, which is what outside observers use, mainly the nodes and miners, to make sure that you perform the ring CT correctly and aren't just making up money like I discussed with the Peterson commit. So a lot of people understand how within a certain transaction you kind of hide among other inputs and then you use only a certain amount. They kind of forget how the inputs look throughout the whole history of the blockchain. So I have all of the inputs from before on the left, and I have the history of just the input you do control on the right. And where it's highlighted red is when this input has appeared in one of these blocks. So the right, those represent older and newer blocks. So the key is you don't actually know why it's reported in the blockchain except for this first case, where it's a coin-based transaction. If it's new money, it's the first time it's showing up, so you know it's a coin-based transaction, otherwise the money wouldn't be coming out of thin air. The second reason would be if you have control over this, you could be spending it. So since you're spending it and you have control over the money you're spending, it obviously would show up in the blockchain as you spending it. And then finally, and most importantly, someone else could borrow your input to spend in their transaction as a decoy. So because an outside observer doesn't know the difference between the second and third cases, they don't know how many times the Monero is actually spent in the blockchain, even though it will appear multiple times. So that's pretty cool, and that's the whole point, right? So one important thing with Monero is we need to be very picky about how the inputs are selected. Because if the other inputs that you select are done unconvincingly, you're not hiding among others really well. It might be easy to say, although there's 6 here, I know which one's a real one because it's the only one that's been spent in the past few months, right? So you can see that it's important for us to choose inputs properly. When Monero first launched, it chose inputs at pure random. So whether they were originally spent months ago or like the same day, they had the same exact chance of being chosen. And that might sound like it's good, but it's actually really, really bad because people are much more likely to spend money that they recently received than money that they've had sitting in their wallet for like months. They're much more likely to spend it right after receiving it. So this was improved. We currently have something I call an improved triangular distribution method, where the majority of the other inputs that you select will be from within the past 1.8 days. So you can see we're heavily skewing towards selecting newer inputs. So it's harder for someone to try and guess which input is the real one based off which one's the newest or whatever attacks that they might try and come up with. Obviously, we're going to continue trying to approach whatever is ideal. Obviously, ideal will change over time as people change their Monero spending habits over time. So this will be something we'll always be trying to get closer and closer to whatever that ideal is. So this is probably the hardest part in making Monero really private. So a lot of people remember that like within the blockchain, everything is able, like you can see everything. So that's why Monero tries to obfuscate everything you can see. But people forget, or I often forget, that there's a process that's required for it to actually get into the blockchain. And so imagine you're a node, you sign a transaction, you need to tell the rest of the network you want this transaction to be included in the next block. And in order to do that, you need to connect to the rest of the network. The network might be logging what IP they get this transaction request from. And so this attack isn't always perfect. They don't know that the node they receive it from is actually the real origin. But if an attacker is running multiple nodes, they can get a pretty good idea that, hey, this node is the real one that the transaction likely came from. And so they don't know anything else about the transaction. They don't know what money you're spending, who you're spending it to, or how much you're spending. But they might say, hey, this transaction is associated with this person. And so they might come to your house, say, give us your private key because we think that you made this transaction, and try and threaten you. And so that's not a good thing. And so you can see here that as the origin node, you connected to a logging node, and you don't know which of these nodes are logging. There's no way for you to know. And as a result, the logging node gets the IP address. And so that's obviously not a good thing. So what we're working on now, we have many contributors working on a Kavri project. So how many of you have heard of I2P before? It's more than average, actually. So and how many of you have heard of Tor before? Okay, so not everybody. So I2P is very similar to Tor. There are definitely some differences in how it works, but you can kind of think of similar anonymity properties for Tor with what we're doing with I2P. If you want, we can talk later about what technically is different about them. But we're going to put all of the transaction broadcast information through this I2P network. So instead of them knowing the origin IP, like the real IP that they come from, they instead get a meaningless, disposable I2P address that has nothing to do with your actual identity or real IP address. So you can't prevent the logging nodes from logging. Like you can't prevent an attacker from looking at the blockchain. So you just need to give them just bad information. And that's basically what we're doing here, is that we're giving them information that they can't do anything. So Kavri is still, it's technically pre-alpha. You can download some binaries right now though to have some basic I2P functionality and connect with the I2P network. But there is no integration with Monero, and I think that's still at least a year out. However, Kavri doesn't only work with Monero. It can work with any other cryptocurrency project. For example, think of Dash, where you have master nodes that have large collaterals locked up. Suppose you knew your neighbor was running 10 master nodes, right? And the rest of the world knew they were running 10 master nodes with thousands of euros locked up in these. They're probably going to be a target for crime. And so it's important for someone to use the system, or at least have an option of using a system like I2P to conceal their node's identity so they don't put themselves at risk. Furthermore, with Kavri, users will have an option where instead of just tunneling the transaction broadcast data, they could tunnel all of the information through I2P. If, for instance, your ISP says, you can't run a Monero node, well, now they don't even know you're running Monero in the first place. But Kavri will work with any other cryptocurrency or any project that wants to use it. And so that's why I think it's one of the coolest projects that's happening in Monero, is because it can be seen across the whole space.
How does Kavri improve over Tor, which they use right now to connect to Monero?
Yeah, so again, just to clarify, with Kavri right now, we have no integration with Monero. So right now, you would have to, you can't just download Kavri, but it will be included in the node software in the future. But with I2P, every participant on the network is also a node. With Tor, you have some nodes like relay nodes, end nodes, but most of the users are just participants that basically leech off of the Tor network for their connections. Like if I ran Tor on my laptop, I'm not also an exit node. With I2P, it's very, very bad at connecting to normal websites. Technically, there is a way to make it possible, but it's meant to, all the connections are meant to happen within I2P and stay within I2P. So that's why we can use it, because we have our own peer-to-peer network with the nodes, so we can have them all through I2P. It's not like we need to ping Google, right, to make it work. The speeds are a little bit faster over I2P also, and also this way we can contribute to a network without leeching it. So let's say Monero became extraordinarily popular, and all of our connections were through Tor. we'd probably put a very large load on the Tor network, right? With I2P, at least all the participants would also be contributing to I2P. So it really doesn't only just help Monero, it also helps I2P. And there are tons of other technical differences, but in general, that's why we chose I2P. So, stealth addresses. This is where Monero hides where the money is going to. We start with the same inputs as before, an unknown amount for a ring CT transaction, or if you're one of the 0.005% of people that are not using ring CT, you would still know the amount that's being sent. And instead of sending it directly to someone's address, like you send it to someone's Bitcoin address, you're going to characterize these outputs as for individual people, but you don't actually know, based on the blockchain, who these are for. So they look like addresses, but it's not actually their address. The person you're sending it to will search all of the outputs to see which one is actually theirs. So you can see here, we send them to 6 different outputs, for instance, and you might be wondering why they're 2 different colors. That's because the red ones are going to the recipient, but the blue ones are coming back to the receiver as change. These 6 outputs could be going to 6 different people you don't know, right? And this is how we break up large change. So let's say you have a 10 Monero input, but you only want to send 1 to someone. You use the 10 input, you send 1 to the person, and send 9 back to yourself. That's how we divide up large inputs. But you can see here that you don't actually, these aren't the addresses, and they'll never show up ever again on the blockchain. So this way, you don't know where the money is going to. So just to summarize, we have an ambiguous origin of the funds, an unknown amount of each of these inputs being used, leading to an unknown amount being sent in the transaction, and then finally going to an unknown address or unknown receiver. So you can see that throughout all of the information stored on the blockchain here, it's all obfuscated in some way. And it's not just something that's obfuscated for some of the transactions, it's obfuscated for all of the transactions. And so I'm going to talk about why in the Monero community, we're very insistent that all transactions have to be private by mandate, or else it doesn't really matter. And part of this is based on our own history. So we've always tried to be a cryptocurrency that has a focus on privacy, but a little over a year ago, there was no requirement that you had to include other inputs in your ring signature. So everyone would know the origin of the funds that you were spending. And 2/3 of people that sent transactions did not use any other inputs. They just used their own. And so that was a big problem for 2 reasons. One, obviously those individual transactions are not private, or at least as private as they could be. And so that's not a good ideal, especially if someone's doing that by accident, because then it's recorded forever. And 2, if no one is borrowing each other's inputs, it's less convincing for you to say, hey, I might not have spent this, maybe someone else did, if in reality no one else is. So that's why it's important for everyone on the network to be doing it, so you don't really stick out, at least within the network. On the right-hand side, I have a different coin there, which offers potentially greater untraceability, but only the red proportion of funds are held privately. And so I'm terrified that an inexperienced user is going to download the Jax wallet, use this coin thinking they're using it privately when they aren't. And we're seeing that very few of the people actually are. So that's why we think it's really important for any network that all the transactions are private by mandate, not some opt-in system. So just moving on to a brief history of Monero now. It was launched in April 2014 by someone named Thankful for Today. We don't know who this person is. So it's kind of like our Satoshi Nakamoto, except he was a lot worse. So he tried proposing a lot of changes the community disagreed with, and when he wanted to go forward with them anyway, the core team, the current Monero core team we have now, decided to fork the project away from him, and the community followed because they hated the one person. And Monero is based off the CryptoNote reference code. It's not based off Bitcoin directly. So as a result, there was a lot of new code that people didn't really understand. And amidst all the chaos of trying to figure out how it worked, patching a lot of security flaws that were there in very early versions, the network was attacked in September 2014 by a very capable attacker who spammed the transaction with a very large number span the network rather, with a very large number of transactions. And at the time exploited a bug, which again, obviously doesn't exist anymore, in order to force a hard fork. So no one to our knowledge lost funds because of this, but it was kind of the pivotal turning point in Monero's history where basically all of the resources that the developers had was shifted from things like the graphical interface or anything with usability directly to security, privacy, security and privacy. So as a result, not too much seems to have happened between September 2014 and March 2016, but the Monero Research Lab published several papers about how Monero can improve the privacy and security of the network. The database was switched to LMDB, so it no longer needed to be stored in RAM, which we knew that it's bad to store the entire blockchain in RAM because that doesn't scale. At least the hard drive, you have a little bit more space, right? And so a lot of those background changes that weren't really flashy were going on within the development community. Finally, in March 2016, that was a very important month because that's when Monero said that all transactions have to be private and include other inputs when you send. So you can no longer just send your own because the network will just reject it. And that was obviously very important. Finally, in December, the Monero developers released the first graphical user interface. Previously, we told all prospective users to use the CLI, the command line tool. And even I thought that was really annoying. And so how could you expect I'm not a developer, but how could you expect any non-developer who isn't even interested in tech really to consider looking at a command line ever, right? And so this was really Monero's first step forward in usability. It was really like a symbolic move. Now we're finally on the second beta, and we're expected to be out of beta and into like a more finalized release for the graphical interface by the end of this year. And then finally, RingCT was enabled on the network in January 2017, which closed the largest privacy leak until this point. And I think now our largest current one is with Kavri, where the transaction information is still revealed to the network. So this is kind of what the infamous GUI looks like. So there's obviously a lot of work that went into it. So this is available on the website for you to easily download. We still encourage most of the users of this GUI to run a full node, but we have an option for you to select a remote node. So if you want to get started, like tonight or something, I would suggest looking at the GUI. In the next few weeks, hopefully, there's a Monero lightweight wallet that should be coming out. This is something that Riccardo Spagni has been working on. He's the owner of My Monero, which is a company. And this is the lightweight wallet. It will be completely open source. You can still check the front and back end of this. And it will be multi-platform, so you can use it on your phone and such. But this way it'll be easier for users who don't want to run a full node. This will be a much better, sustainable way for the network for people to not run a full node using lightweight wallets. And you can see there kind of a mock-up of what it looks like. So, with Monero, if you have all transactions that are always private, how do you have any transparency or regulatory compliance? Because we understand that in some situations you want transparency on the network. And so that's where the view key comes in. I'm not going to get into the cryptography behind it because I'll bore everybody, but it's just this specific key you can give to someone, either for individual transactions or your entire account, and it reveals the incoming transaction information for, again, either the account or just the one transaction. You can give this to selected parties. So you can give this to your best friend, and hopefully only they know as long as they don't share it. Or you can put it on your Facebook or website for everyone to see. That's your choice. The most explained use for this are for charities. So consider the Monero project. On our website, we have the Monero donation address and also the Monero view key. So people can verify or see the amount of money coming into the donation address. And that way people can check to see there's no rampant corruption or something going on. And then also with parents, they can create accounts for their children, keep the view keys, and have some level of control over the children's accounts. So I also want to talk about some of Monero's limitations because I think it's really important. I kind of hinted to this earlier, but Monero is not really based on Bitcoin's code. It's forked from a completely different project. So if there's a project in Bitcoin, like confidential transactions, that we want to have in Monero, it needs to be basically built from scratch, so that we end up with something like Ring confidential transactions. And so it's not a simple task. It takes a lot of work. And it also takes a lot of work for exchanges and wallet providers, because they can't make a few tweaks to something they already support with Bitcoin. They basically need to start over. And for a lot of these smaller companies, it's kind of a non-starter, at least right now, right? So as a result, we don't have any hardware wallets that support Monero. Ledger is currently evaluating right now whether they can or not. Key told me months ago they would like to, but they, to my knowledge, have made no progress. And Trezor wants us to write the code for them to include it in their Trezor. So right now we're still kind of far away from hardware wallet. You can still store Monero safely with with cold storage or paper wallet generated offline, but there's no convenient way to really store it safe, like very safe. Right now, the easiest way is with the computer, and that's as safe as however your computer is. And then on the right, we don't have a mobile wallet that looks like that. Again, I hope we will have one soon, but since it is, given the nature of open source projects, we don't really have determined release dates for these. They're released whenever they're done. So right now, if you wanted to use it on your phone and you tried to search for Monero wallet, you're going to come across Free Wallet, which stores your private keys. And so this means they could lose your money at any point. And furthermore, it completely defeats the purpose of using Monero in the first place if they can trace how you're using it. So I highly suggest people don't do that. Instead, just use a web wallet. It's not as secure as private as like an ideal mobile wallet, but at least it's more secure than your other alternative options. But right now, most users are probably tied to the computer. So, ongoing development, I want to talk about some of the easier things to visualize. So the first one is multi-sig. Right now, if you're spending Monero with a merchant and you give them Monero with the hope that they'll give you something, the merchant might just run away with your Monero and never give you what you actually bought. And so that's not ideal for adoption. With multi-sig, you can basically throw an arbitrator in between that can hold the funds in the meantime and only release them if you actually get what you bought. And so that's important for increasing adoption of Monero, and also adoption into exchanges like BitSquare, renamed to BISC. Sub-addresses. Right now, if you publish your Monero address on your website, and also your super underground DJ website that you want to keep separate, you're creating a link between yourself. And the way to avoid that now is just to create two different accounts. But we understand that's not ideal, especially if you want to have them all go to the same place. So sub-addresses will allow you to post addresses in different places that people aren't able to link to each other, but still go to the overall main account you would think of. And
I have Bitcoin, right? I create a new public key to address for the sending.
Yeah.
That's not what you can do with Monero? You just have one private key, one address?
We have two private keys and two public keys, actually. Okay. But with the current implementation, you have one address.
Oh.
Most of the work has been done for sub-addresses. So right now it's in the testing and implementation phase, but the core work has been mostly done. We also did the work for disposable addresses, which is very similar, but a different way of approaching the problem. And we decided sub-addresses are better because it's harder for an attacker to be annoying.
Could you use as well stealth addresses?
So stealth addresses impact how you send money to someone. You're still sending it to the same address. It's just that outside observers don't know what that address is. Does that make sense? So that's how stealth addresses work. You're sending money to the same address, but you don't know, other people don't know what address you're sending it to. With sub-addresses, you might, if you're expecting to receive Monero, you might give a different sub-address to different people. It's a different address to each person, and they will still end up in the same amount. So you would still be protected with stealth addresses. You would use, in that case, both stealth addresses and sub-addresses. And so an example of a sub-address being used, let's say you're using Shapeshift. and they have this return Monero address field, just put a sub address in there. And that way they don't know what your actual account is, but you can still receive money if there's problems. And since, given the nature of ring signatures, the only identity that they know of you is your IP address, which you can conceal too. Third, translations. The community has worked really hard to update the wallet software, but to give you an idea of how not into this we are, Germany is one of the most densely used regions of using Monero, or countries of using Monero, and these were just kind of worked on this year, and we're several years old as a project. So we're definitely behind on translations. Like I said, we've recently kind of started to catch up with the wallet, but as far as documentation, like how anything works, how anything about Monero works, or anything, it's all in English. So if you want to make a real impact later, just make a simple guide, like how to use Monero in German or Russian or whatever you're familiar with. And then I think that would have the potential to help a lot of users out. Fourth, I mentioned this earlier, the lightweight wallet that's being worked on. I don't want to talk too much about that one again. Website redesign. So the Monero website isn't really terrible, but it's pretty bad. And so someone's been working for the past few months on a website redesign. They redesigned the Kavri website. They're using the same framework for the Get Monero website, so it's done. It's just that we're re-updating all of our English information for it, and then we need to translate all that information into all the other languages too. So there's a lot of work to be done in the coming months on the website. And then finally, ring CT optimizations. Transactions with Monero are larger than Bitcoin transactions. They're a lot larger. And so a lot of our core team members have been working on optimizing ring CT in order to make it take up less space in the blockchain. Going forward, long term, we will need a second layer solution like Mimblewimble, Lightning Network, or similar, so that we can continue to scale at large transaction volumes. Because if we meet Bitcoin's current use, we're fine for a few years, but we will need a second layer solution on top of it. So, just introducing the hard fork schedule. Monero has 3 hard forks this year, and we typically have about 2 a year on average. So in January, that one was enabling ring CT. In April, that one brought updates to our dynamic block and dynamic fee amount. So we don't have a hard-coded block size limit of 1 megabyte or anything, and our fees aren't hard-coded either. Instead, they adjust based off supply and demand. So if a lot of people start using Monero for a while, it'll eventually will increase the block size too. And if people stop using it, it will decrease over time also. And then in September, you can think of this as a privacy update. This one brings mandatory ring CT, so everyone has to use it, again, for the 3 people who aren't. And also increases the minimum ring size to at least 5, although potentially greater. And then the ones not in bold are ones that aren't tied to this release, but I expect it to be around this time, in addition to other stuff I didn't have room to list. But Fluffy Blocks has a weird name, but the idea is that the nodes already receive a copy of the mempool. Why do you need to resync the block if, across the whole network, if they already have most of the information from that block in the mempool? So this way they just verify the block, and if they already have the information in the mempool, they don't need to basically double sync the data like we do now. This is currently in testing right now, where we have several just people volunteering to run their network. And so we're just trying to remove bugs before we move into implementation of such a system. But this would be really helpful. And also with I2P, if all the transaction broadcasts are done through I2P, and we don't need to resync also over the block data, that means most of our maintenance of updating to the latest blocks will be done through I2P, which is good to put most of it through I2P. And then finally, improved input selection algorithm, which I anticipate you'll see in every update going forward because there's always a reason to improve it. So one thing I've been astonished to see is the large community growth. So this is a number of the subscribers on our Monero subreddit. I joined when we were around there, and it's kind of gone up a lot since. So it's been striking to me because I'm no longer the one that's answering a lot of the questions on on Reddit or Stack Exchange, because usually within 5 minutes there's like 2 other answers from knowledgeable people that have already answered it. So I think that's fantastic to see. Similarly, we see with development commits that we're seeing the number of commits have been going up per month too. And so that kind of shows that the developer community has also been growing. And so really cool to see that. Okay, so that's all I have for me about the formal presentation. Our official website is getmonero.org, so if I interested you in any way, I really encourage you to go there. Subreddit, as I explained earlier, is Monero. We also have similar ones for price or like trading or mining or whatever you're interested in. We have a good technical community on Stack Exchange. So if you like really want to know how RingCT works, like go to the Stack Exchange site. And then finally, my email address, in case you want to talk to me specifically for some reason, in case you didn't get enough of me here, that's my email address. Okay, so thank you again for taking the time. I hope you're able to learn something like So now I'll just ask questions then. So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk, and it was really good insights. And I'd like to know a bit about coin supply and coin distribution and coin aspects.
Yeah, so we're proof of work. We're going to stay proof of work. We use a more accessible mining algorithm. So we're currently mostly GPU mine, but you can still mine on a CPU at lower cost than the electricity. You might not pay off a hardware investment, but it'll be more than your electricity. And we're committed to staying ASIC resistant, as we say. So if ASICs become predominant, we'll switch to a different system. As far as the coin supply, so it kind of looks like BrootX. So instead of changing at certain points, it gradually decreases every single block. And there will be about 17.4 million Monero, very small amount, but only 17, million Monero generated within by the next 2 years, so including the previous generation. And then at that point, there will be a perpetual inflation of 0.3 Monero per minute forever. So less than 1% inflation, but will continue. That way, miners aren't incentivized to only buy fees. There's always some black involved. Any other things you want with coin-related fundamentals?
Yeah, maybe the initial distribution or how the project funded.
Okay, so Monero was launched fairly, no pre-mine, no instant mine. It started from zero. It was pre-announced, and it was launched as it was supposed to be. There is no official amount of the block. So right now, all of the block reward goes to the miner, and will and always has been that way. So there is no official community fund or anything set aside. It's all done through donations. One way that we've found that's been very successful so far is through our website with a form funding system. It's similar to like a GoFundMe, but with Monero. So you can pitch a project with certain milestones, and people first decide whether this is something the community wants. If people generally agree, then it can be moved on to receive funding, and then it receives donations just from whoever wants to donate to the project. And so far, I would say every single project that has moved on has received donations in this way. So for instance, I created my own form funding system proposal for some of the first talks I did about Monero in Zagreb, Athens, and Rome, and donors reimbursed the travel costs for some of those. So it's, even for things that aren't necessarily correlated to the project, it still could be something that the form funding system can be used for. And so I know that people often say, like, oh, it's a tragedy of the commons, but we've just seen the opposite of that so far. So I think that's really cool. Yeah, so most of the developers work for free. Those that don't use a form funding system. Yes?
You just change the import method. You say if Essex
With
comes along,
consensus.
you just do hard fork and then you
Yeah, well,
Everybody-
with Monero right now, our approach is let's just hard fork.
So
when we get larger, that'll be harder because there will be more contention. But we have voiced several times that we have the intent of committing to such a proof of work. So at least that won't be the roadblock if there is one going.
So everybody's just following the developer team and what they say is really executed in the community.
Yeah, so they'll go through consensus. Like with Ring CT, there was long discussion about whether we should add it because it increased transaction size and cost, but very few people were against it because it really, built our core of maintaining privacy or improving the privacy. So if there's no consensus, then then someone's just going to fork the project away. So we don't really want to do that. It's even we're proof of work. So ultimately, whatever the miners say, right? So if the core team proposes something that no one wants, ultimately it's up to the miners.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I think it was excellent. I think
I'll get you in.
I think you mischaracterized privacy in Bitcoin a little bit, and you know better, I think, because of course there are ways to decentralize mixing in Bitcoin, but I think they're not as bad.
Are you like the Tumblebit or something?
Tumblebit, CoinJoin, Lightning.
Well, with CoinJoin, you still have a trusted server.
It's not trusted.
That's exactly what Dash uses as CoinJoin. You have the trusted.
I'm not talking about Dash, just Bitcoin. You can have.
Dash uses CoinJoin.
Okay. I don't know anything
Yeah.
about
So
Dash.
yes, there are methods that people take to help protect their privacy in Bitcoin. They might purchase their Bitcoin from someone physically in cash. They might mix their coins several times. They might use decentralized exchanges like BitSquare that don't need information about the user. So there are definitely ways people can improve their privacy with Bitcoin, except it comes at a greater cost. And since not too many other users are doing this, it makes you stand out a little bit when you're trying to go through all those processes.
I didn't want to actually ask about that.
Okay.
So you mentioned that there needs to be some optimizing going into RaceCT.
Definitely.
What is currently the state of the Monero blockchain? Are blocks always full? How do blocks adapt to that? How costly is it to use Monero?
Yeah, so right now a typical transaction with medium priority with Ring CT costs about 13 cents. And we have an option for you to use a low transaction priority, which is a quarter of that, although most people use just the normal default. However, there's a several day window for adjusting the block size. So we can't just have transaction volume increase in 1 hour, and then like by the end of the day, it's already like triple whatever it was, right? So it takes several days in order for it to actually grow, and it is capped at a certain growth rate. I don't specifically know what it is, but it's not going to double in a week, right? It's going to be a relatively slow growth.
This adjustment is done based on how full the blocks are.
Correct. Based off exactly. And so right now, I think about 15% of our blocks are empty within the past year. So there's definitely some room, and the miners are penalized for actually increasing the block size. So that way they don't just artificially do it, right? So yeah, I think looking forward, if we do receive as much use as Bitcoin, we should reevaluate how it works. But I think right now it's working very well for us. And there's no reason that it shouldn't work with Bitcoin, with Bitcoin's volume, but we haven't been there yet, right? So I don't want to promise too much. Yes?
Question on the size. How many full nodes are there today? How many mining nodes?
So among full nodes that have their ports open so that other people can connect to them, there are about 1,000 throughout the world. There's probably a little bit more, but just one of the websites that tracks some but not all says around 1,000. So yes. it's hard for me to guess how many miners there are. I'd say thousands too, but I don't really know the answer to that question. If you want, we can look up like how many GPUs it would take to like equal the mining power later. Yep. Anyone else? Yep.
Is there some pruning happening at the blockchain level?
Yeah.
Storage?
So pruning, not yet, and we do have some pruning limitations compared to Bitcoin. So with Bitcoin, you know when outputs were spent. You have something called the UTXO. With Monero, the whole point is you don't know when people spend their money. So we can't get rid of old we call them TXOs because we don't have UTXOs. We can't get rid of old transaction output sets because we don't know if people still need them. So we'll need to store a copy of those for it. And that means that as far as pruning is concerned, we can only get rid of about half of the information. So it's still something that we would like to take advantage of when the time comes, when the development is ready for it, but it won't be to the extent of Bitcoin or most transparent systems.
So one add-up question to this, because I was using Monero before the December smartphone, and I noticed that the blockchain, I needed to reset the blockchain shrunk by, I think, a factor of 2.
Oh.
So my impression was that there was some pruning, something wrong.
That I don't know if there have been optimizations along the way. I don't think anything was quite around half at the time, but I know when we switched from the in RAM database to the storage, like hard drive storage, that it did cut the block size in half, blockchain retroactively in half, just because it was a more efficient way to store the data. And that's actually one of the things we're proudest about Monero, is because the person who makes this data system is heavily involved in our project. It's LMDB, and he's around all the time. So it's great that we have like direct support from someone who writes this stuff.
Who is this?
No, it's Howard Shue. Yeah. HYC. Okay, anything else, or should I put you all out of your misery? Okay, well, feel free to talk to me afterwards. I'll obviously be here for a while. Thank you so much for coming. Like I said, please go to our website and just check it out, among anything else. And I just hope you learned something. So.
Sorry, one thing. You mentioned Jax earlier as a wallet. Does it actually support Monero?
No. So I'll talk to you afterwards about the long history of Monero. But they recently announced that they would like to add Monero. But long history of Monero. Okay, thanks again, everybody.
Just thank you very much for such interesting talk, and